Right, can we mute that somehow, please? I'll let you get on with it. Now, next, please ensure your electronic devices are silenced while the inquiry is sitting. As you'll have realised, it's being live streamed by Microsoft Teams, and anyone who wishes to attend that way can obtain the link on the council's web page. Be a little bit careful that it may continue during breaks and it may pick up comments that you may not want broadcast. And don't use the chat function. Housekeeping, there are no fire drills planned today. In the event of the fire alarm sounding, exit the building immediately, and go out the door and follow round and go down the 18 floors of staircase. If anyone requires mobility assistance, make their way to the goods lift. Does that apply to anyone here today? No. Okay. Thank you for that. So this is an inquiry into an application that has been called in for determination by the Secretary of State under Section 77 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990. The application is by Marks and Spencer plc. It is for the demolition of the 3 existing buildings on site, the construction of a ground plus 9-storey mixed-use development, use Class E, comprising retail, cafe, restaurant, office and gym, as well as a new pedestrian arcade, public realm works and associated works, 458 Oxford Street here in London. First of all, I'd like to know who's here and who speaks for the appellant. For the applicant, please. That won't be the last time I make it.
No, as my Julius pointed out, I made that mistake at least 17 times a year.
Only 70?
Yes. And so we've got a schedule of appearances which I'll ask to be handed to you. Here it comes. I'm going to read it out for everybody else, that there are some copies.
Thank you.
So you'll see that I appear on behalf of Marks and Spencer. My name is Russell Harris, KC. I appear with my learned friend and sister to my right, Heather Sargent. I propose to call 4 witnesses, and in this order: Mr. Fred Pilbrow to deal with architecture, Dr. Chris Millay to deal with architectural quality, townscape and heritage issues, Ms. Mel Allwood to deal with sustainability issues, and Mr. Chris Goddard to deal with retail and planning matters. Mr. Goddard has COVID and can't be here. He's on the feed. We think he'll be better and free of COVID by the time he's due to give evidence, but if he's not, he'll have to give evidence, subject to your leave, on the screen as well.
Okay, or we could reorganise the witnesses. We can discuss that.
I'm grateful, thank you. So those are our appearances.
For the local planning authority.
Good morning, sir. My name is Sioned Davis. That's Sioned, and Davis IES. Council. I'm instructed by Louise Metzen and Kirsten Cohen, who are both senior solicitors at the council. We don't propose to call any witnesses, sir, but we do have Mr. Matthew Pendleton, who's sat immediately to my left, who's the Principal Design, Conservation and Sustainability Officer at the council. And just behind him, Mr. Mike Walton, who's the Area Planning Officer, in case you have any questions.
Thank you. Could you put those names and qualifications?
I've sent it to your case.
Fantastic. And to me. And for say, Britain's Heritage.
Good morning, sir. My name is Matthew Fraser. I'm a barrister at Landmark Chambers, and I'm instructed by Henrietta Billings at Save Britain's Heritage to represent Save. I will be calling 3 witnesses: Mr. Simon Sturgis, Ms. Julie Godefroy, and Mr. Alec Forshaw. And what I'll do, sir, is just as the applicant has done, I'll set out their qualifications in writing and submit them tomorrow morning.
Thank you. Now, I'm aware of 4 or 5 other people who wish to speak. Are they? Who's here this morning? So 4 hands, 5 hands, starting at my left, please.
So I'm Eric Reynolds. I am the chairman at the moment of SAVE, but I would wish to address you as an expert in regeneration and reuse of buildings.
Thank you. Next person. Yes, lady.
Julia Barfield, I'm an architect. Julia Barfield, I'm managing director of Marks Barfield Architects.
And are you supporting or objecting?
Yeah.
Next person, gentleman there.
Dr. Chris Whitman from the Welsh School of Architecture, here representing Heritage Declares.
And objecting? And finally, no, another person on that side, lady there.
Barbara McFarlane, I'm an architect and I'm representing the Climate Action Network. ACAN.
I think I know which side you're on, and somebody on this corner.
So I'm Jessica Toll, I'm the local ward councillor in the West End.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, gentleman straight at the back there.
My name is David Coftry. I'm an architect. I live in London, and I have some comments to make generally about the proposal. And in general, I support the SAVE campaign to have this inquiry.
Anyone else? Okay, I know that at least one person is coming tomorrow morning because they're unavailable. If anyone else shows up who does wish to speak, if they can let me know at the very earliest opportunity. My thoughts are that I'll hear the openings today and then I'll hear your statements if that's convenient. If you have them written up, then it would be helpful if you could let one of the program officers, I'll come to them in a minute, have a copy, have it so that it can be copied and circulated before you make your statement. So it's the lady at the back there, Emma Ross, who needs your statement. Okay, so yes, moving on to her. Emma, can you just wave your hand to introduce yourself to the people who are going to speak in a few minutes' time? If they could give you their statements, if you could copy them and circulate them to me and the main parties, please, that would be very helpful. She has agreed with a member of each of the main parties to act as joint programme officers, and you may see us talking outside the inquiry. She's a technical support officer at Westminster Council, but has had no dealings with the merits of the case. She'll also act as a point of contact for the members of the public to keep up to date with progress, and together they'll maintain the document library and ensure that all documents submitted are recorded, circulated, and added to the online library. If you want to keep in touch with her and in touch with the inquiry, a telephone number is 07866 035 740. Now, I've had, I know that the appropriate notifications have been carried out, and I see from the numbers here that they've been received. Can the council make sure they're recorded as core documents, please? I've received and read proofs of evidence from the applicant and SAVE and all the rebuttals submitted. I've scanned the appendices, but not necessarily read them in full. With a few notable exceptions, I've not yet looked at the core documents unless passages are specifically referenced in the proofs. I have received and read a number of statements of common ground. Thank you. Has everyone had a chance to comment on these? Nods? Yep. Okay. Anything to add to them or any areas where further agreement can be reached?
Potentially, yes, sir. You'll note in the exchanges that have taken place before the inquiry a suggestion that there is the potential for a round table in relation to carbon matters.
Indeed.
I've discussed this with my learned friend. The witnesses are in constructive discussions with each other, and we're hoping as a result of that that there might be at least a statement of common ground further to that which presently exists. I can't promise, but that's the hope.
Splendid. Okay, so moving on, conditions, are these as the council statement of the case or as a new list of conditions?
My understanding, so, is as per the statement of case.
No change? Mr. Harris?
That's correct, so no change.
Okay. And the latest draft of the planning obligations, is that going to be the final version?
I think that's still in discussion, sir. I know that there are no substantive differences between us and the local authority, but I wouldn't like to promise that it's absolutely the last version at the minute.
Okay.
But you're safe to use it for all substantive purposes until we tell you otherwise.
Thank you very much. As usual, I'm happy for the final signatures to follow the close of the inquiry, but I would want the final drafting to be before it closes. Mr. Fraser, has SAVE seen the conditions in 106 and are they content with them or have they got any comments?
No comments from SAFE, sir, no.
Moving to inquiry sitting times, there'll be mid-morning and afternoon breaks and lunch for an hour at around 1 o'clock. I'll aim to adjourn each day at about 5. In the interest of being family friendly, I'm trying to finish properly on Fridays. As usual, I'll ask the advocates to find convenient breaks and review the timetable from time to time. I shall follow the relevant inquiry procedure rules. This means I'll first identify what I consider to be the main issues before the inquiry and deal with any other procedural matters. I shall then give the opportunity for a short opening statement by each of the main parties to help everyone understand the broad basis of their arguments. Does the council wish to make an opening statement or not?
I have prepared a brief opening statement, so just to set out the councillor's case, we reserve our position on closing, that's just to see how things go.
Okay, thank you very much. So after the openings, I'll hear from other interested persons who wish to make a statement, as I just outlined to you. They may also be asked questions by the advocates for the opposing side. As some of the evidence relates to the interior of the buildings, I'll then conduct an accompanied site visit so that I can follow everything that is being said. That's planned for this afternoon. And then from tomorrow morning onwards, I'll hear each witness for the main parties, starting with the applicant. The evidence will be subject to cross-examination. That's to say, each witness can be asked questions by the opposing parties and any interested party who has spoken on the opposing side to the witness. The witness will then be re-examined to clarify any matters arising from the answers given in cross-examination, and I may also have some questions. I'll hold a session of the inquiry dealing with planning conditions and legal obligations. I'll explain those in a moment. Finally, the main parties may sum up their cases in reverse order to the openings, ending up with the applicant. Ideally, these will be in a form that can be included in my report to the Secretary of State with a few changes, but I'll return to that later. Does anyone anticipate any procedural difficulties at the moment? Splendid. One more thing is, this inquiry relates to an application that the usual appeal rules don't imply in the same way as regard to costs. But is there any intention to apply for costs over any procedural matter? No, splendid. If that changes, let me know as soon as possible. Turning to the site visit, thank you for the suggested route. I'm very happy to carry this out. Can we try and mute that?
We have asked, and apparently it's not possible, so apologies.
Okay. There'll be no evidence or submissions allowed at the visit, but I will ask the relevant witnesses to point out to me any features I need to note in order to understand the evidence that they have given. Will somebody be able to point things out to Mr. Goddard?
Yes. We'll ensure that somebody from DP9 is on the site visit and that Mr. Goddard briefs them beforehand.
Okay.
There is one issue in relation to the site visit, which I've been discussing with my learned friend this morning, and which you I think have correspondence on.
Right.
And that is we welcome the site visit this afternoon and the suggestion from SAVE that it's more extensive than just in the interiors.
Okay.
So you go wider.
Yeah.
With that in mind, and we're going to ask you to go anyway, we think that you should go to the Kensington building, which is on Kensington High Street. It's
Yes.
referred to a number of places in the evidence. It needs to be an accompanied visit because it's not open to the public yet.
Okay.
And we think that, if you like, while you're in the area, it would be sensible for you to go to the Kensington building accompanied. Clearly, you need to be accompanied by parties from both sides.
Yeah.
It has been set up for today. It can be today. The only issue might be timing, in which case we'll do it another time. But we think it makes sense to do it today at the same time as your other internal and external visits.
I'm very happy to do that. I've also been asked to visit other Marks and Spencer stores, which I'm happy to do. Could we fit in the Pantheon store on Oxford Street?
I'm sure we can, sir, yes.
There's a reference to Stratford. Now, does that mean Stratford on Avon? Stratford.
I actually think it is Stratford upon Avon, isn't it?
Okay.
No,
Well,
Westfield.
There is also reference to the Westfields.
Yeah, there are two Westfields.
Oh, are there two Westfields?
There are two Westfields, one in Stratford and one in Hammersmith.
Okay.
And there are Marks and Spencers in both. I'm not sure the reference to which you make, because there is also a reference to an out of London Marks and Spencer in the evidence. I'll check.
Okay, well, it sounds like I need a lot of clarity. There's also Clapham and Stephen.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, now I'm very happy to do these, probably after the inquiry closes, if that's all right with you.
Yes.
Now, it's been suggested that I tell the staff when I'm visiting, but I'm not going to do that.
That's fine.
Because I don't want them engaging in a conversation. So I hope that's.
So by definition, they're open to the public. Use class order.
Okay, so if you can clarify which stores they are, then I'll deal with the ones that are further distance, unaccompanied, after the inquiry closes. Thank you. For this afternoon's visit to be manageable, numbers need to be limited. Other than a small number of witnesses from the main parties, does anyone else feel the need to join the visit in order that I understand their evidence? Drawings. Are the drawing numbers as the draft condition?
They're also found in Appendix or Annex A of the stated contract, CD 902.
Thank you. And any revisions since the application? Splendid. So I now turn to what seems to me to be the main issues in this application. My provisional assessment of these is first, the effect of the proposals on the significance of designated heritage assets derived from their settings, with particular regard to the listed buildings at Selfridges, 400 Oxford Street, Grade 2 Star, 10 Portman Street, and 2429 North Audley Street, Grade 2, and to the Mayfair, Portman Estate, and Stratford Place conservation areas. I haven't altered these since the pre-inquiry meeting. The effects on the significance of non-designated heritage assets, with particular regard to Orchard House Street, 11 to 25 Granville Place, 7 to 9 Portman Street, 1 to 7 Portman Mews South, Hesketh House, and 43 to 45 Portman Square. The effect of the proposals on the UK's transition to a zero carbon economy, with particular regard to the scheme's sustainability and its whole life carbon assessment. For the weight to be given to the public benefits of the proposals, including improved retail floor space, employment, new commercial floor space, improvements to Hesketh House, permeability and connectivity through the site, and improved public realm, regeneration of Oxford Street, and any improvements to the character and appearance of the area as a result of urban design, townscape, and architectural quality. 5, whether the public benefits will outweigh any harm identified in the heritage balances, and whether the same benefits could be achieved with less harm. 6, the extent to which the proposed development is consistent with government policies conserving and enhancing the historic environment. Chapter 16 of the National Planning Policy Framework 21. Finally, the extent to which the proposed development is consistent with the development plan for the area and the overall planning balance with regard to the NPPF and any other material considerations. Thank you to everyone who helped put together a draft timetable. Mr. Harris, you've already explained there's ongoing discussions on whether or not there's a round table. Yes. So we'll talk about that in the morning. Just on that, if there is a round table, then it would help me. I don't know if you've worked out an agenda for it, if there's going to be one. But I'd like to be taken through relevant policy and guidance, identifying what is mandatory, desirable, aspirational, and so on. The relevant tests and why they should or shouldn't be adopted, the calculations using those tests, and then conclusions from that.
Thank you, sir.
So looking at the timetable, apart from the round table, is everyone happy with the order of witnesses in the latest draft? And just for clarity, that runs the applicants for witnesses, as Mr. House has outlined, followed by SAVE's 3 witnesses. And at some point, we'll deal with conditions and obligations, ideally towards the end of this week or early next week, so there's time in case there's any change.
Thank you very much, sir. I've discussed the timetable with my learned friends. We think it isn't one of those very tight timetables. We think there's spare capacity in the timetable.
One final word on that is that if it's there's a round table which would save a little bit of time, the closings are programmed for the final Friday. Let me know in due course if you think that's enough time to prepare your closings. I'd rather give you a little bit more time and have them better.
Yes.
Because it's easier.
Yes. More time doesn't necessarily mean better, though, sir. But
it might be shorter.
It might be shorter. Yes. But we've all agreed that if we can travel with the expectation that we might finish on the Friday, but if it's going to be over onerous, we will let you know.
So, thank you very much. Anything else before we proceed? Oh, one more thing. Is there any new evidence put into the inquiry? If so, I'd like it today, please, rather than in dribs and drabs. So, if there's nothing else,
So just one thing, if I may, and that's I've been asked. That's just that I've been asked to notify you that the council are intending on recording the Teams meeting. I've asked the next one why you need that, but
I don't. As long as there's nothing to do with me,
okay.
I'm quite.
Thank you, sir.
So, if there's nothing else, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, sir. And we've got the opening statement in written form. I'm going to rattle through it quickly. It's going to be over it'll be over a half an hour because of the nature of the case. And there are copies for third parties, but I'm going to read it out. So first point,
just before you start, are we going to call documents put into the inquiry documents? In which case, whoever's recording.
That's what we had in mind. So I think this may be APP1 or something like that.
I can give this, sir.
Thank you very much.
Very good. May it please you, sir, 2 main points are raised in this inquiry. First, the specific matter upon which the Secretary of State particularly states he wishes to be informed of, the heritage impacts of the proposal of this location, and you have framed your main issues by reference to that in part. And as to this matter, the approach to be adopted is uncontroversial. As you know, the proposal involves the demolition of the existing 3 buildings on the site. As you also know, the buildings don't fall within the 78% of the borough which is in a conservation area. The buildings are not listed or listable, and the demolition would not be an EIA development, such as already been screened. As such, as you know, Parliament has already granted planning permission for their demolition, subject only to the prior approval procedure as to the method of demolition and restoration. It does so through the General Permitted Development Order. None of these matters are or can be the subject of dispute with any party, though surprisingly the unchallenged existence of such a permission does not appear at all in the analyses of those who would now seek to retain the buildings of this inquiry. proposals replace the existing 3 unprotected buildings with a new flagship store of high architectural quality, which would bring extensive heritage and public benefits, including the retention of an M&S store at this location in a store, which now would be worthy of the international centre within which the site sits. It will bring the regeneration of this part of Oxford Street, which is otherwise self-evidently failing, and it will bring a new, vibrant, enhanced set of animated and safe retail frontages and public spaces, along with a mix of uses, which meets the pressing need for further employment floor space at this council location. These public benefits, and particularly those related to the function of the international centre, are emphasised by the fact that if this application fails, M&S will not continue to trade from this location. Having worked with the local authorities to achieve a workable solution for this failing store now for well over 4 years, they will not invest further at this failing location. They will close the store and cease to be represented at this end of Oxford Street. So we are clear that in heritage terms overall, the proposals would be an enhancement to the setting of the relevant designated heritage assets. What they replace is a pretty, as you'll see, pretty undistinguished set of buildings and ugly, unfunctioning spaces and places when read as a whole. The council accurately described the overall impact of the proposal, including enhancements to public realm, as a tremendous improvement in this context, direct quote. And so on any reasonable view of the evidence, any heritage harm, including the loss of those parts of the existing buildings, which are undesignated heritage assets, would be significantly outweighed by the heritage and other public sustainability benefits of the proposal, applying the now well understood fasciculus of policies contained in national policy on heritage as they are applied to the particular circumstances of this site in London. I call that your Citroen approach, so for obvious reasons. Okay. On this basis, we say there's no heritage reason for opposing permission. Second issue, and again, you put this into a suite of issues. Second, there is the matter of the environmental sustainability of the proposal, and in particular, the suggested potential for the reuse or refurbishment of the existing buildings to meet the planning needs of the site. And this matter is raised by the Rule 6 party, SAVE. As such, this has been properly identified as one of the main issues by you. Interestingly, however, you will note it's not specifically been identified as a matter about which the Secretary of State particularly wished to be informed. If it were such an issue, he would be required by regulations 5 and 6 of the relevant rules to say so. He didn't. And as to this matter, the application falls to be determined in accordance with the development plan when read as a whole, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And so I don't need to tell you this, but care is needed to remember that that's the formulation, because there are those who would say that this is some type of test case concerning the appropriateness of refurbishment as a concept. Well, so that's nonsense. It is no such thing. The decision to be made by the Secretary of State is a planning decision, which falls to be considered having regard to and in accordance with the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And there is nothing in national nor London plan policy which requires refurbishment of a site in preference to redevelopment. Neither is there a development plan policy that, in all circumstances, prioritise refurbishment over other sustainable development. If there were, sir, then regeneration of the entire spatial strategy of making the best use of land would be significantly frustrated. So each case falls to be determined on its own particular merits, and in doing so, you apply the policies of the plan as they are, not as one would wish them to be. And that's what both local authorities have done in this case. They have considered this application in the appropriate way. They've concluded that the proposal is in accord with the development plan when read as a whole, and in particular with the plan's spatial requirements for this site at this most sustainable location and in that context, with specific plan policies on the circular economy and carbon efficiency. Neither authority identified a development plan policy test requiring developers to have to rule out any reuse of the buildings prior to any demolition, facilitating sustainable redevelopment. That's because there is not one, and for good reason. But what they both do, what both authorities do, in fact, is accept the planning need and justification for demolition in order to generate the huge and undoubted public and sustainability benefits of the proposal, and to meet the needs of the development plan spatial strategy for urgent change of this location. Urgent change of this location. Against that background, so let it be understood, and I hope reported fairly, let it be understood and reported fairly that no party to this inquiry is saying that viable, deliverable refurbishment of the existing buildings, which meets the requirements of planning policy of the site, exists. No party. The highest it is deliberately put by SAVE is that there might be a refurbishment option, which might bring some of the benefits of the application scheme, and that it, SAVE, is not satisfied with the process which led to the choice to redevelop the site for the uses now proposed, even though the planning authorities were so satisfied. And so we say for you, the question to be asked at this inquiry, therefore, is whether the assertion that there might be a refurbishment option, which might bring about some benefits of the proposal, could be seen as sufficient on the evidence to turn away the undoubted, real, and immediately deliverable public and spatially sustainable benefits of the proposal. And this question is particularly apt when the alternative to the benefits wrought by the proposal would in reality and in fact be the departure of M&S from this part of Oxford Street and the further inevitable deterioration of what should be one of the capital's most sustainable, vibrant and vital locations. Further, sir, you will wish to note, and I'm glad you've been able to look at the rebuttals, that despite raising the issue of the alleged potential for so-called heavy refurbishment of this site with the local planning authorities for years, the first and only essay at what such a potential refurbishment might actually look like was produced as a new sketch evidence in the very, very last paragraph of a rebuttal proof served on the last day that evidence could be exchanged. Now, so life is too short to make a complaint about this. There are some barristers who wouldn't take it as magnanimously as that, and you and I know who they might be. We shall have to deal with this new evidence at the inquiry. We don't need to put new evidence in to deal with it for these reasons. Because the assertion underpinning this new sketch, which is no more than there might be a refurbishment option along these lines, it is such that we know now why it's never been seen before. It's helpful to us. The newly produced sketch introduces, as we shall see, a product which, for all of the very reasons already anticipated in the applicant's evidence in relation to any reasonable refurbishment option, is demonstrably unsustainable, unworkable, undeliverable, and unfundable. It's not supported by any commercial or expert retail or office evidence, despite the clear and incontrovertible evidence on such matters contained in the applicant's evidence. Overall, sir, on this second issue, SAVE's concerns about process do not give rise to a breach of the development plan and should not in any event stand in the way of the proper optimisation of this critically important site for London. Ironically, you may think, the fact is that refusing this application on sustainability grounds will result in the turning away of a very significant contribution to the spatial sustainability of the capital on perhaps one of its most sustainable and least constrained sites. At one and the same time, it will result in the loss of M&S from this location and the consequential further continued decline in the town centre hierarchy, itself one of the central components of London's sustainable location strategy. That outturn from us all sitting here for 2 weeks would itself be wholly unsustainable at a time when the need for transformational change is both urgent and compelling. The council's words, not mine. So the case for the proposal is based on 4 propositions, each one of which has been accepted by the relevant planning authorities. I now turn to these. The existing site and its 3 separate buildings make a wholly inadequate contribution to the spatial operation of a sustainable capital. They are not suited to meeting the land use requirements for the site. Second, the existing buildings are not protected from demolition. They make a limited contribution to the settings and significance of a number of designated heritage assets. Third, the proposed redevelopment clearly meets the spatial requirements for this site and brings very significant public benefits. Fourth, the proposal brings those huge public benefits without unacceptable harm and entirely consistent with the government and development plan policy on sustainability, circular economy and carbon. First point, existing site. So I don't know whether you know this, but Parliament requires London by law to have its own spatial development strategy. It also requires that document to be called and thereafter to be known as the Spatial Development Strategy for London. And in a shocking piece of anarchy, I persuaded the Mayor Livingston in 2000 to ignore that statutory requirement, that it be known as the Spatial Development Strategy, and to declare that the first Spatial Development Strategy should actually be known as the London Plan. The London Plan. I thought it was a good idea at the time, but I've long since seen that advice and that decision as a mistake. Because although snappier, the title, the London Plan, fails properly to convey sufficiently the purpose of this document, which was, for the first time in 40 years, to direct the development London needs to the most spatially appropriate and sustainable locations in the capital. The purpose of the document is to ensure that the needs of London today are met at locations and in ways which don't compromise the ability of Londoners who come after us to meet their needs also. Now, so the new London Plan is still, unfortunately, known as the London Plan, contrary to the statute, but it makes it even clearer that if the UK is to meet its international and national obligations in relation to sustainability, including to zero carbon, then certain parts of London have to grow and certain parts of London have to densify in a way which meets the pressing need for new development in the capital. London needs to meet the social, retail, its social, retail, economic, employment and housing needs. And the need for development has to be met, or the very essence of sustainable development, which requires the meeting of the needs of today, is thwarted. Development has to be in the right place, or else unsustainable patterns of development and hence unsustainable patterns of travel and large-scale carbon usage will proliferate. Successful mixed-use places that make the best use of the best placed land are therefore needed. To that end, this London Plan, this, as it should be called and known, Spatial Development Strategy for Greater London 2021, is more than any other before it, underpinned by the concept of environmental sustainability and carbon neutrality. The concept of good growth, every letter you get from the GLA will have good growth on it. The concept of good growth thus lies at the sustainable heart of the new plan. It sits proudly at the top of the letterhead of the mayoralty. It's the biggest spatial component in ensuring that development in London is environmentally sustainable. Getting the spatial location of new development right is the single most important thing that the London planning system can do to help achieve the UK's net zero carbon target. And at the heart of the concept of good growth is making the best use of land at the most sustainable of locations to meet planning needs. This places a requirement, and if you could underline the word, that would be one to underline. This replaces a requirement on decision makers to direct needed growth to the capital's most sustainable locations. And there, a requirement to optimise development consistent with context. It identifies the sustainable locations to which development and intensification must be directed. The appeal site, perhaps uniquely, lies within almost all of the areas identified in the London Plan as representing the best possible places to secure sustainable patterns of growth in the capital. It's a brownfield site at an important location in an international town centre of global importance. It sits outside of a conservation area, is served by the highest public transport index possible, and it lies at the heart of the central activity zone, where a massive growth of employment floor space has to be accommodated. It is thus at the very apex of the capital's most sustainable locations, where growth is required to be accepted if sustainable development means anything. The existing buildings, you see these today. The existing store was in part not designed to be a retail building, or indeed to be occupied by a branch of what would become the UK's best known department store, much less what should be its flagship store in a globally important centre. The building's composition and internal makeup reflect their history. It's a speculative 30s office building of its time, reflecting structural expediencies of 30s technology, and an accretion of later make do and mend editions of no quality, which have accumulated, adapted, and been converted in a piecemeal way over the century. The three buildings now mainly house Marks and Spencer Marble Arch. In retail and in wider planning terms, the store element of the buildings at the site should now be serving a thriving flagship function at this place of global importance. The buildings are failing in this respect and others, and M&S explain why in their evidence. So we say they do so cogently and expertly. Their evidence explains that customer expectations of a store, especially at this location in the Global International Centre, where it would need to compete with the other flagship stores of international quality, simply cannot be met in and about the existing buildings. That's due to its multiple and compounding constraints. These constraints reflect its structure, composition, and history. As such, the buildings are now not close to fit for purpose. Uniquely, in my experience, Marks and Spencer has chosen to disclose to you and to the Secretary of State its trading and football figures for the store. They confirm a trading pattern which is inconsistent with the function of the site and the centre, and which in retail and commercial terms is frankly unsustainable. As a result, it is and has been M&S's long held and consistent public position that they will not continue trading from this store, which is failing. Overall, therefore, the existing buildings are not suited to their present retail purpose. They are not functioning sustainably or consistently with spatial strategy, and their failure represents a significant missed opportunity. It's the opposite of good growth. The fact that the existing store is failing both contributes to and is compounded by the fact that the west end of Oxford Street is also in decline. So that decline is obvious and palpable. Go there. It has a smell, a tangible, unmistakable expression of decline. So during the pandemic, this whole idea of inspectors being able viscerally to understand the site is one that's been a subject of debate. This is exactly the sort of inquiry where that visceral feel is required. When I say go to the site, it has a smell. You will know what I mean on the site visit this afternoon. It is a failing centre, and that decline needs to be reversed if this part of the capital is to continue serving its function as part of the International Town Centre. Such centres are required, you can underline that word as well if you wish, to be the focus for the majority of high order and comparison goods retailing, while securing opportunities for inter alia higher density employment in a high quality environment. The council described the need for change at this part of the iconic shopping street, part of its jewel in the crown, as both urgent and compelling. Urgent and compelling. And the help of town centres and of this capital's town centre network of centres as multifunctional places, which allow mixed uses to thrive, which allow link trips, which provide the benefits of clustering, is spatially critical in environmental sustainability terms. Town centres, and particularly this one, are required to provide national and international hubs of sustainable growth and densification, so that the prospect of having to engage in unsustainable patterns of travel or to meet needs in urban sprawl or out of centre are minimized. The carbon consequences of getting this spatial policy right are literally incalculable. The existing buildings don't come close to contributing to this important purpose, neither do they insist in reversing the obvious decline of Oxford Street Indeed, they add to it. They represent a wasteful and inefficient use of land inconsistent with sustainable development. But for the reasons I've already outlined, the position is more stark in retail terms. Because without Marks and Spencer's at this failing location, and they will leave if this application fails, the decline of this area of the centre will accelerate dramatically. So too will its consequent ability to act as a spatially important, sustainable location for growth. There is now, sir, on the evidence, the retail evidence that you hear, no department store operation in the UK retail market which would come close to being in a position to take the entire site vacated by M&S. Debenhams have gone. House of Fraser's not there. There are no other operators that can take this sort of space and occupy it in the way that the development plan requires it. Therefore, on Marks and Spencer's departure, the site would inevitably be split up, and in the absence of quality of occupier that might be found for the remaining space, apparent you'll see from the existing non-M&S retail representation in the vicinity, there would be an outcome. And that outcome would be further decline. And further decline is not consistent with the requirement that investment in Oxford Street should enhance its position as a globally competitive retail destination. This part of the International Town Centre does double purpose because it also sits in the CAS. In this part of the CAS, so important is the strategic employment function of the zone that the provision of offices is to be given even greater weight than even the meeting of London's pressing need for housing, which from your other caseload you know is already usually the top agenda in London. In this part of the CAS, even more important, even greater weight should be given to providing employment land. Housing, indeed, for these reasons, is not an acceptable use at the application site. And the failure of this site at present to make any meaningful contribution to employment uses at all in the heart of the West End is a glaring one. And through its spatial strategy, Westminster also reflects the need for new development at the heart of the capital, especially on Westminster's less constrained sites such as this. Thus, the spatial strategy specifically requires, there's that word again, growth to be achieved through new developments with increased scale and massing that respect the local context, including along Oxford Street. This will, we are told, include the transformation of Oxford Street to ensure a more diverse, a more interesting mix of uses, a better quality public realm that prioritises pedestrians, enhances the shopper experience, and makes it a more attractive place to visit and to enjoy. Along with an improved public realm, the built form of Oxford Street offers scope, the development plan says, for increased height to deliver a range of commercial floor space that complements the retail offer and provides modern workspace, reinforcing its role as a key commercial centre. Those requirements, that need, speaks directly to the application site. And under the very heading good growth, not this time in the London plan, but this time in the city plan, we're told by Westminster that, quotes, investment will be necessary to achieve good growth that enhances the West End's position as a globally competitive retail destination and secures a diverse range of office space that supports increased employment opportunities in the growth sectors and takes full advantages of the opportunities of the Elizabeth line. You may be able to go on that, they said. I think the station's open, so it is the best way of getting to the site. So the strategy in terms, this is the development plan policy, requires transformation and change, not more of the same. In summary, therefore, so the existing buildings are failing to make an appropriate contribution in retail and town centre terms, are inefficient and wasteful in terms of the uses which are on site, make no contribution at all to the strategic function of the CAS or the stated need overall to transform Oxford Street to create a globally competitive retail mixed-use multi-functioning designation. And as I understand it, sir, these conclusions, none of them are being or capable of being in realistic dispute. They're certainly shared by the local and strategic authorities. The potential for refurbishment. Marks and Spencer's is one of the country's most responsible of businesses. Their remarkable and recent track record of reusing and repurposing their own stores and as you see from the evidence, other town centre buildings owned by their now defunct rivals is second to none. Wherever and whenever they can repurpose a building consistent with the needs of the location, they will do so. Their record speaks for itself and is the best real-world evidence of their bona fides in this regard. This experience also gives them, doesn't it, an unparalleled expertise as to what is truly achievable and practical in retail and mixed-use terms in and around existing town centre buildings. And they have, as a matter of fact, with their advisors and from the outset, considered the potential for the existing 3 buildings at this historically important location for Marks and Spencer to be refurbished for their own retail purposes and for the wider purposes which reflect the place of the site in the spatial hierarchy. So they've done so proportionately and with the direct guidance of the local and strategic authority as to process. That's important and reasonable at a time when non-statutory guidance on the circular economy and other matters was emerging after the application was made. They, Marks and Spencers, have concluded from their position of extreme experience that the existing buildings, with all of their multiple constraints, cannot feasibly, practically, or importantly, viably be refurbished consistent with the needs or the spatial needs of this location. That conclusion has been considered robustly by the expert and wider team of the GLA and by Westminster, who have both independently confirmed compliance with the relevant policies of both limbs of the development plan. And in particular, both authorities agree that the proposal optimises the use of the premises consistent with context and that policies dealing with the circular economy are complied with in full. Having agreed that the existing buildings were not suitable to meet the requirements for the site properly understood, officers have sought to understand the relationship between the proposal and the existing building in terms of whole life carbon, resource and energy use, hence the request for consideration against the existing building light touch refurbishment. Further, sir, based directly on the allegations relating to refurbishment potential contained in a full report of objection by Mr. Sturgis, acting on behalf of SAVE, and following the finalisation of the specific guidance on circular economy and other matters, the GLA reaffirmed its conclusions that the London plan should not be read as excluding the appropriateness of redevelopment. Indeed, I say in parenthesis, if London is to meet its development requirements, redevelopment is essential. And importantly, they reconfirmed that the applicant had, in all of this context, sufficiently justified the demolition of the relevant buildings. Further still, and for the purposes of this calling, to deal with SAVE and Mr. Sturgis's continued assertions of the potential for an undefined notional deeper refurbishment, nationally respected retail architects who have undertaken almost all of Marks and Spencer's refurbishments across the UK, and West End expert retail and office market witnesses have all been asked to reconsider the nature of the building and the prospects of any reasonable refurbishment scheme meeting the requirements for the site in the life of SAVE's continued intentions. And that analysis, which is all before you, establishes that for any reasonable refurbishment, there are inescapable constraints embodied in the existing 3 buildings and their juxtapositions, which mean that they are simply not suited to meet the legitimate requirements for this site. Thus, in office terms, the conclusion of Knight Frank are unambiguous and consistent with the findings of the local authorities. They find that the inherent and inescapable constraints of refurbishment on the existing fabric, including floor to ceiling height, can't be changed, column grid pattern, and the structural need post-pandemic for places of work in the International Centre to be of the highest quality to be viable, all mean that any reasonable refurbishment of these 3 buildings for office purposes would simply not be deliverable, it wouldn't be fundable. The production of a substandard employment office at this location would generate an income which would not come anywhere close to paying for itself. Period. Without viable, deliverable office provision at this location, so there is no prospect of a retail-only refurbishment. No one, not even SAVE, is suggesting otherwise. The inescapable unsuitability of this site for a viable and deliverable office refurbishment is by itself thus fatal to the objector's case. In retail architecture terms, you've seen Sir Brian Tracy's evidence. He's on the call, he's listening. He's the architect responsible for many of M&S's most successful refurbishment schemes, and he explains that he has considered this project from the earliest days. His expert evidence remains to the effect that the functional and structural issues with the three separate buildings, and with their own construction method, each with their own construction methodology and grid, are so fundamental that any reasonable refurbishment offer would neither meet the needs of the site, the operator, nor be deliverable. And in retail market terms, Nash Bond established that Oxford Street is failing within the centre, experiencing the worst retail environment for 50 years, that the existing store is not of appropriate quality for this location, and that the constraints associated with the existing buildings, including its 1930s largely office building facade, this was built as an office, are inescapable and incapable of being overcome given the requirements of retailers within the international centre. Nash Bond also described the consequences of the loss of M&S from this location as terminal. If M&S go from this location, this sector of the international centre is terminally harmed. So a site visit will confirm the likely accuracy of this report. Finally, Mr. Goddard himself, a nationally recognised retail planning expert and surveyor, who can speak to all of these matters and gives evidence on all of these matters, agrees and adopts the evidence of the other witnesses. He also explains his clear instructions to the effect that M&S will leave this location if this application is refused, with the likely result that this part of Oxford Street would decline rapidly in Harmony. Mr. Goddard will also explain why the points raised in relation to any reasonable refurbishment option in the various proofs apply with the same force in relation to Mr. Sturgis's late advanced sketch scheme. It's helpful, sir, because it illustrates the inadequate and undeliverable nature of the refurbishment offer. SAVE, on the other hand, you will note, does not call any planning evidence. It does not call any retail evidence. It doesn't call any spatial evidence to support its suggestion that there is a viable, deliverable refurbishment option which meets the spatial needs of the site. It relies upon, and I assume adopts Mr. Sturgis's evidence, which is now to the effect that A, he accepts there has been an assessment of refurbishment options, including heavy refurbishment by the applicant. B, he assesses, in his eyes, that assessment to have been deliberately inadequate. And C, he says that both local authorities, have separately failed in their duty as planning authority properly to discharge their duties in relation to the process of considering circular economy matters as part of planning balances. He and SAVE, as a result, hear some of it this morning, argues that there might be a viable refurbished option which might deliver some retail and office development to the site. That's as far as he puts it. So just to be noted, sir, and I make no apologies for repeating it, that at this inquiry, which is considering with the Secretary of State whether to grant planning permission for the proposal which is before it, that it is not now anyone's case that there is actually a deliverable refurbishment option. The highest it's put is that there might be, and that SAVE is not satisfied with the nature of the process, which has led to the strong support for the principle of redevelopment from the authorities. In assessing the application against the provisions of the development plan, you want to know, and your agendas already helped us very much with that, you will want to know where these concerns, as now voiced by Mr. Sturgis, sit in the statutory scheme. And the first thing to make crystal clear is that there is no development plan policy requirement in the London Plan to test or to reject refurbishment to a particular or any degree or in any particular manner as an option in place of the sustainable redevelopment of the site. Suggestions that there is such a policy basis are plain incorrect. Policy D3 is the policy which requires the optimisation, the making best use of sites which are spatially most sustainable as part of the good growth agenda. It is one of the main and most important tools in the London Plan's policy box to achieve net zero by 2050, as we've seen. Policy D313, in that context, deals with the circular economy matters and requires development proposals on such sites to quotes, take into account the principles of the circular economy. That's the development plan position. Neither this policy nor any other development plan policy therefore requires redevelopment as a matter of policy to rule out any form of refurbishment as a condition precedent to a grant of planning permission. Neither does it prescribe a particular means of assessment or consideration. Paragraph 3312 of the London Plan helps even further, because it provides that making the best use of land needs to be taken into consideration in deciding whether, or of course whether or not, to retain existing buildings in the development. In other words, consistent with D330, retaining a building or part of a building is not a policy requirement in and of itself, and certainly should not frustrate the making the best use of land. And it would, wouldn't it, of course, be perverse to require the reuse of the building if that thwarted or was inconsistent with the making of the best use of the land or of the wider and greater spatial strategy, which has environmental considerations at its heart. It's a wood and the trees issue. This logic is also reflected in the new guidance on the circular economy, which has been writ large. Guidance is, of course, not policy. And if it is treated as such, sir, I think the basis of your agenda, a legal error is made. Further, guidance cannot alter or countermand what policy is. And in this case, much of the relevant guidance was not even finalised until well after the application was made. So it must, for example, in relation to guidance on pre-application matters, be applied proportionally and reasonably, and we'll know you do that. Notwithstanding all of these health warnings, the guidance on circular economy makes this clear. But unless there are heritage considerations which necessitate retention of a building, not this case, it can now be demolished as a matter of law and is a non-designated heritage asset as best, then if the existing buildings or parts are not suited to the requirements of the site, then it can be appropriate and indeed entirely consistent with the principles of the circular economy to redevelop the site to meet pressing needs. Further, this common sense position of ensuring that the requirement to have regard to circular economic matters should not stymie the greater goal of creating sustainable patterns of development is also reflected in WCC's environmental guidance and in terms. Again, it's not policy, but it points out in line with policy that retention of existing fabric needs to be, quote, carefully balanced against other sustainability objectives, such as the need to deliver new homes and economic growths. This, it inevitably points out, means that in a place where the requirement for additional floor space is huge, demolition will still be an appropriate and necessary part of any rational spatial strategy for optimization. And nothing in this new guidance on how to prepare whole life carbon assessments can alter the logic of this policy position. Thus, the reference to prioritising reuse and retrofit, much used by SAVE as part of the preparation of a WLC assessment, can only be read in the context of the development plan and other guidance understood as a whole. It cannot and does not mean that priority should always be given by the decision maker to a refurbishment of the buildings, particularly where these have been found not to be suited to the requirements of the site and or which failed to make the best use of the land. That would be perverse. It would be a derogation, not an application of the provisions of the development plan. Second, notwithstanding the absence of a policy requirement to rule out alternatives involving refurbishment, it's patently clear from the above that the alternatives to redevelopment, including heavy refurbishment, have in fact been considered and examined proportionately and very carefully by both the applicant and the relevant authorities as part of the application process and since. What Mr. Sturgis' concern on behalf of SAVE expressed now is that he himself does not think that the assessment was sufficient. And the reasons for that difference become really, really clear when it's understood how Mr. Sturgis approaches his preference for refurbishment and the way in which that differs from the local planning authorities and the development plan, which require making best use of the site and the meeting of wider spatial needs to be part of the assessment. One simple answer tells you all you need to know. In answer to the question posed by the circular economy guidance note are the existing buildings suited to the requirements for the site? Mr. Sturgis simply says the answer has to be yes, as the existing uses of office and retail can clearly be continued with the appropriate comprehensive retrofit approach. In other words, more of the same. No consideration has been given to the poor contribution of the existing site to the spatial requirements, the requirement of the retail offer on Oxford Street to be transformed, the harmful consequences of not meeting the retail needs of the opera on the site, and no consideration at all of the viability or deliverability of the alleged alternatives. These failures to have regard to the central requirements of the spatial plan explain why there is a difference of opinion between SAVE and the authorities. Finally, sir, and we'll hear it, I'm sure, later, every SAVE document relating to this matter contains the assertion that M&S should be prepared to put up with a solution that is suboptimal for them. The difficulty with these assertions is that, first, Marks and Spencer's ambitions for the International Centre are entirely consistent with the spatial strategy for Oxford Street identified above. In planning policy terms, therefore, they should thus not have to put up with a suboptimal solution. The planning system should be seeking such a solution. The constant refrain that M&S will have to make do is rather an explicit acceptance that a refurbishment is bound to be significantly inferior to the proposal. Secondly, in the real commercial world in which you have to operate, in which the planning system operates, Marks and Spencer's simply do not have to put up with a store which is not fit for their purpose. In a democratic world, they cannot be made to trade in a suboptimal way, however often it is said that they should. The fact that they will leave the site if its legitimate aspirations of this location are not met is not at all a threat. Such threats don't work. It is a commercial fact. And the potential land use planning consequences of that fact are clearly relevant, I would say central, to the decision of the Secretary of State. It would be wrong for Marks and Spencer not to draw this conclusion and this fact to the decision makers' attention. Now, so I've sped overly on that, no doubt, because I'm not sure whether those issues, the sustainability issues, spatial strategy issues, are issues that you come across before in that same way. I'm now turning to heritage matters, and I know exactly where you are in relation to those, so I'm going to be very brief.
So in answer to the first, and it's something I was going to ask, I am very familiar with the issues, but I haven't come across them as a main issue in an appeal inquiry. Yes. If that has been the case, and there is such a decision, I'd be interested to.
Yes, well, I don't think that has, which is why I spent the time. I've checked your past caseload, most of which I'm relatively familiar with, and therefore I spent a bit of time. And I hope that was helpful. That's understood. Good. Now, so back to our normal fare. The existing buildings are not protected from protection, demolition. They make a limited contribution to the settings and significance of a number of designated heritage assets. This section of the opening can be brief because we've got an expert tribunal well used to dealing with such matters, and because the contribution that the buildings make to settings is properly reflected in what is agreed to be their status. The fact that as a matter of law, the buildings are not protected from demolition and indeed have been granted planning permission for demolition by way of the General Development Order is an undeniable fact. Of course, that doesn't mean that the issue of demolition should not be considered as part of this application, which is an application to demolish and redevelop. Clearly, it should be and has been. But the extent of the extant grant of permission for demolition by order is not simply some sort of legal peculiarity. The decision to grant permission for demolition in these circumstances is a policy-driven decision, not a legal one. Planning permission, whether given by direct grant or by general order, represents the planning system's view of where the public interest lies. And in this case, and this is relevant to both limbs of the case, government has said that it is not appropriate or in the public interest for developers to need to apply for planning permission or much less to pass tests for demolition of buildings such as these. Further, the fact that the application site does not lie within a conservation area is and can only be deliberate. It was not thought important enough to qualify or to pass the tests required for inclusion. That's a legal fact. Local authorities are under a constant duty to consider and reconsider the boundaries of conservation areas. There is no suggestion that Westminster is in default of such a duty. The statutory requirement is for it constantly to consider conservation area contribution and whether the conservation area should be extended. Next, the absence of listing of the Orchard House building or parts of it is also deliberate. It's not a building which has somehow slipped through the listing net. An application to list the building has, of course, recently been rejected by the Secretary of State, the very Secretary of State responsible for determining this application. His conclusion on that application and the certification which followed will, of course, be given full weight by that decision maker and by you. It follows, sir, that the highest heritage value that can be ascribed to any part of the Orchard House building is that of non-designated heritage assets. And large parts of the site, notwithstanding that status, as you see, clearly detract from the settings of the relevant designated assets, as the site visit will demonstrate. Selfridges, the main but not only designated asset in play in the present case, is bold, confident, appropriately a little brash, and monumental. It is a hugely significant presence, but in truth, very little of any of its significance derives from the Orchard House facades and its environs. That judgment is, of course, consistent with the fact that the boundaries of the conservation area are now drawn tightly around it, Selfridges, and do not include the application site. If Selfridges truly relied as an important building within the conservation area grade 2 star, if Selfridges truly relied upon the application site for its significance, then the exclusion of Orchard House from the conservation area would be inexplicable, and it's not. Overall, therefore, Orchard House is not protected from demolition at all. Indeed, it has a planning permission to be demolished. Its exclusion from the conservation area and the refusal of an application for it to be listed are legal facts. Whilst Orchard House is a non-designated heritage asset, the designated assets do not really rely on it for their significance to any meaningful extent. Which brings me to C, the proposed redevelopment clearly meets the spatial requirements for this site and brings very significant public benefits. And as I've already said, I don't see this as being in any significant doubt. The spatial requirements for the site have been carefully sketched out above. I've done that because they are relevant to the issue of whether the existing collection of buildings can, in truth, be suited to meeting the planning and other good growth requirements of the site. So this section of the opening can also be briefer. This is because the proposal has, with the specific assistance of the authorities, been specifically designed to meet these needs, these requirements. Proposals make the best use of the brownfield land in the town centre with the highest public transport level of accessibility. From the earliest pre-application meeting, the principle of redevelopment of the site to be a multi-use transformative presence on Oxford Street has been strongly supported. The proposals replace 3 interconnected, 4 pieces of townscape when read as a whole, with a high-quality, sustainable building of exemplary design quality. They replace existing extrable public realm permeability with a high-quality arcade through the site, restoring a traditional route, a new pocket park at Granville Place, widened and safe footpaths along Oxford Street and Orchard Street. All of this is consistent with the requirement, underline it if you wish, for investment to transform this part of Oxford Street. The proposals sustain and enhance the retail offer of the street in a significant way. Footfall will increase. There'll be an overall enhancement of the functioning of this part of the retail frontage. The provision of grade A offices, much needed, will be significantly improved. There's presently none. These premises would be expected to let quickly and efficiently, introducing for the first time a true multi-use CAS offer at this key location. It would deliver at one location more than 10% of the forecast floor space requirements of the city. The building would be one of the most sustainable buildings in the whole of the capital, with offices achieving a BREEAM outstanding. Overall, so this is a package of public benefits which is strategically important in terms of its delivery of the spatial vision for Westminster and London. D, the proposals bring these huge public benefits without unacceptable heritage harm and entirely consistently with the government's and development plan sustainability policies. So the impact of a proposal upon heritage assets is rarely assisted by lengthy submission. So I propose simply to consider SAVE's primary submission, namely that the proposals unacceptably harm the setting of Selfridges as a grade 2-star building. Other impacts, including the ones you've identified in the main issues, will be covered in full in evidence and or closing, but to a significant degree will also depend upon the decision maker's conclusion in relation to this main relationship. And the first thing to note is that Selfridges, as mentioned above, is one of the most robust demonstrative buildings in the whole of London. It was designed to have that swagger, to have that presence. And that means that the vast majority of its significance is intrinsic to the building in and of itself. It is, as the Secretary of State has recently put it in another case, significance which is locked into the fabric of the building. None of this intrinsic significance is disturbed at all by the proposal itself. Further, the proposal sits in the International Centre, but outside the conservation area. And Oxford Street at this location is properly. Have a look, sir, here. I'll have a look on site, obviously, but both these models establish it. Is properly characterised by strong buildings of scale and presence. The existing setting of Selfridges and of the conservation area itself is thus already characterised by buildings which properly reflect the globally important nature of the centre. This is appropriate and not harmful. It's part of the existing character of the conservation area. And you may think it's of more than passing note that the owners and occupiers of Selfridges share the applicant's view that the proposed M&S actually enhances the significance of their listed building. This opinion, though inexpert, is nonetheless instructive, where a significant part of the case against the proposal is that it's said to diminish the presence of and to compete with Selfridges. Clearly, in retail terms, the owners of Selfridges simply don't see this. Finally, sir, a building's presence and dominance depends on so much more than just its size or its height. And Selfridges has a presence and a prominence and a robustness because of its form. It's a statement building which brings, excuse me, it's a statement building which deliberately brings a block of Chicago to Oxford Street. It creates the context and does not respond to or need one to be significant. The whole purpose of it was to deliver Chicago to Oxford Street. It created its own context. Consistency. It has, well, you see, 21 recessed bays separated by giant engaged ionic compounds, which are not shy or sensitive to neighbours. It has detailing which is exquisite and omnipresent. It's not ever likely to be challenged. And in this context, the proposal provides a building which reflects the proper function of the site, Art and International Centre so should do. And it does so with a single building purpose designed for its place. Doing so, it sweeps away the awful elements of the existing townscape, which clearly add nothing to the setting of Selfridges, and positively harm the setting of conservation areas. Deliberately, it does not challenge the monumentality of the Selfridges building. It presents, rather than a grand order, a finer grain, detailed, gridded facade, which is complementary in materiality, but is clearly subservient to the giant order of Selfridges. And it is a building which is broken down by its angled building line and changes in grid heights, which specifically respond to Selfridges' presence on the street front. The model at the back will show that. As you are aware, sir, the applicants, the City of Westminster and the GLA identify no harm. So on your sliding scale, you've got City, GLA and the applicants, no harm to the setting of Selfridges as a result of the proposal. Indeed, City specifically assert that the proposal represents a tremendous improvement to the appearance of the site as a whole in its consideration of the impact on setting. Now, if you and the Secretary of State decide that there is an enhancement, then significant weight and importance should be given to that enhancement compared to the existing. Historic England does fight harm. It does. But unlike other cases that you and I have been involved in, it has not objected or indicated that planning permission should not be granted, having regard to other heritage or planning benefits. It puts the level of harm to Selfridges as that on the lower end of less substantial, which explains, I suspect, why it hasn't objected. On the other hand, SAVE's contention is that there is harm to Selfridges towards the middle to upper end of less than substantial harm. So I say without hesitation that that is simply not sustainable. And it's a judgmental benchmark, which is not rational and does not respect recent court or Secretary of State's decisions. You'll be aware of the Secretary of State's decision at Summerskill House, for example, because it built on your analysis of Citroën and other inspectors' analysis such as occurred. It's apposite in the circumstances of this case. And regard really should have been had to it or evidence like it. The inspector's analysis was to the effect there that the range for a finding of less than substantial harm is very wide indeed. From a harmful impact that's hardly material to something just below that high bar of substantial harm. In cases where the impact is on the setting of a designated heritage asset, it's only the significance that asset derives from its setting is affected. And that's how you frame the main issue in this case. All the significance embodied in the asset itself would remain intact. In such a case, unless the asset concerned derives a major proportion of its significance from its setting, can't be said here, this is Chicago jetted in, then it is very difficult to see how an impact on its setting can advance a long way along the scale towards substantial harm significance. In the present case, sir, for the reasons set out above, Selfridge's building significance is very substantially locked into its fabric. Most of its significance is entirely independent of its setting. It's flown in from Chicago, a contextuality is part of that intrinsic interest. Any harm to the significance of a designated heritage asset would, if found, be given considerable weight and importance. But where harm, if any, lies on the scale is relevant to the nature of the public benefits which would be sufficient to outweigh such harm. And of course, the demolition of Orchard House building will involve the removal of its significance, but as an undesignated asset. In the present case, the public benefits identified above are not repeated here, are strategic in scale and importance. So the very future of this part of the International Shopping Centre is at large and will be secured by the proposals. Both local planning authorities were correct in their conclusions that applying that fasciculus policies, the public benefits associated with this proposal very significantly outweigh any conceivable harm to heritage assets designated or non-designated. I'm going to deal very briefly with sustainability details. In addition to the matters discussed in A above, SAVE now also raise a number of detailed methodological criticisms relating to the GLA and the WC's consideration of carbon elements of the case. In brief, it's alleged that those local authorities were incorrect in concluding that, quotes, all outstanding sustainability, development and environmental matters have been satisfactorily addressed. So we say, frankly, this allegation is misconceived. And it's very clear that, with respect, SAVE has not at all followed or had sight, necessarily, of the detailed engagement between the GLA and the applicant. You'll know from the way that proofs have run and the selection of amended and altered proofs that have been supplied within relation to this, that it was wholly aware of what the GLA had sought from the applicant or what had been submitted in return. That's a shame, because the existence of such an interchange and the fact that the GLA is fully satisfied, both as to substance and methodology, was always in the public domain, with the documents relied upon mentioned in terms in the mayoral reports. And it's particularly important in relation to this part of the case because the development plan sets up a process which is meant to be cumulative, which is meant to be iterative, and which is controlled by the GLA expert officers. And in the particular circumstances of this case, the GLA reports specifically explain why, in their expert opinion, the proposal is net zero consistent with policy SI2. This includes the requirement to make an offset financial contribution to the borough's offset fund, which the policy and guidance accepts as an appropriate, and indeed in most cases involving major development, necessary approach. That offset payment is consistent with the delivery of net zero development and will, outside of anything the Secretary of State decides if planning permission is granted, continually be reconsidered and reassessed by the GLA as the project proceeds through its next stages. The GLA also indicates that the submitted whole life carbon template satisfactorily addresses the policy to fall and is acceptable. It advised a specific approach to the use of BC, you become familiar with all of these terms, for example, which the appellant has reasonably followed. And regarding the circular economy statement, all of the additional information sought at all stages, including strategic approach demolition, was submitted, and as a result, the application they found accorded with London Plan. So the London Plan specifically gives the GLA an important and strategic role in policing applications of this nature and in policing the operation of its own policies. It's recognised as world leading in this regard and exercises its duties proportionately and using judgment on a case by case basis. There is no reason in this case to set aside its clear conclusions that the proposal complies with the relevant London Plan policies on such matters. We've suggested, as you've seen, that a series of meetings between the parties should take place so that the exchanges between the applicant and the GLA can properly be understood. Overall, sir, the requirement to reverse the decline at Oxford Street is, as the authorities say, both urgent and compelling. The GLA and the council were correct to support the proposal, which would transform this part of the centre and secure its future, comprehensively outweighing any harm to heritage assets cause. Refusing this permission, however, would stymie the delivery of a sustainable path of development and lead to further substantial and inevitable decline. And for these reasons, we will be asking you to recommend the grant of permission. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. We'll break in a moment. You raised a couple of matters which are touched on in the evidence, but you now bring to the fore. And so rather than save my questions on these witnesses, I thought I'd raise them now. The first is that the question of demolition. And I think it would help me, Ms. Davis, if you could set out chapter and verse so that I've got something to refer to in my report and position with regard to demolition. Are you happy to do that?
Yeah, so is that with regards to the DPO?
The second is that, in the sense that and other matters you raise regarding the applicant's intentions, you put forward a sort of fallback positions, if I can use that phrase. Now, I don't want to set hairs running. I don't want any new documents produced for this inquiry. But I would be interested in any contemporaneous documents, perhaps between the applicant and their architects, whichever architects it might be, that set out the likelihood that M&S would demolish it, because they haven't done it yet.
No.
And therefore that's a realistic fallback. The likelihood that if permission isn't granted, they would either demolish or sell the store. And the confidence I could have that they would actually occupy the 2 new floors proposed for the foreseeable future. As I say, I don't want any new documents, but if there are existing documents from between the applicant and advisors in the past, then those will be helpful.
And they will be provided, sir.
Thank you very much. Anything else before we break? Then I suggest we're not speaking here for a full day, so we can keep this short. If we adjourn until 11:45, the inquiry is adjourned. Yeah.
Right.